Carl Jung paid considerable attention to the phenomenon of religion, and an entire volume of his collected works is dedicated to the study of the psychology of religion. This study took place during a rapid decline of religiosity in Europe, when suspicious attitudes regarding religion arose, largely as a consequence of the progress of the scientific worldview. Jung came to believe that religion was a significant force in our psychological health, and its decline may have serious ramifications for our mental well-being. As rates of depression and suicide rise rapidly in industrial societies, many modern psychologists have ascertained what Jung predicted nearly a century beforehand. Religion can have a positive impact on mental health, as it is known that religious people suffer lower rates of depression, suicide, and other psychological ailments. Therefore, it is crucial to understand the effect that religion has upon our minds, and what steps can be taken to counteract the negative effects associated with the decline of religion in the modern world. Before we discuss Jung's opinions on the matter, it will be worth devoting a few minutes to explaining the idea of religion. Religion is nowadays dichotomized and presented as an alternative to science, but this is a false dichotomy. Science and religion are not opposites, since they fundamentally deal with different matters. This error arises due to the false belief that religion is primarily a method of explaining the natural world. While this is true to an extent, it is an error to suppose that religion exists as a way of explaining the world in an analogous manner to that of science, and religion serves more significant functions than merely as a means of explanation. For example, to say that Zeus is a god of lightning might explain the origins of lightning, but what Zeus represented to the people who worshipped him is significantly more profound than merely as a generator of a natural phenomenon, since he was the king of the gods and a father to many other significant figures in Greek mythology. For early humans, explaining the world was not a particularly great priority when more immediate problems existed, such as the problems of morality, justice, and values. Religion developed in response to mankind's growing self-awareness and the psychological problems which accompany this predicament. The majority of religious texts are devoted to explaining how one ought to live, what we should value, and what is considered righteous behavior. How one ought to live is a problem which needs to be resolved before one concerns himself with how the natural world functions, and it is also a question which science cannot easily answer, since it is predicated on value, which is fundamentally subjective. Since each religion has different answers to these problems, they cannot be said to be all equal to each other. They do, however, all provide people with a schema of how they ought to conduct their lives in accordance with a particular moral standpoint, and therein lies one of the major contributions which religion gives to our psychological lives. It is common today to think of religion as being a relatively minor part of one's life, something relegated to Sunday mornings or to certain holidays, but in the past, religion was the very fabric of society. In ancient Egypt, everything was understood in the context of religion. There was no separation of church and state, because the church was the state. People lived in accordance with the will of God, or so they believed, and the highest echelons of the government functioned through religion. We should also note that there is a clear link between the growth of religion and the behavioral sophistication of humankind. Religion appears to be extremely old, even older than agriculture, and there is good reason to suspect that our sudden fascination with ethereal, supernatural entities is what put mankind on the path to civilization. The earliest cities were built around religious temples, and such temples formed the nucleus of society. Religion was instrumental for facilitating human cooperation on an unprecedented scale, operating through the collective unconscious to grip our minds, so to speak. This is why religion can exert such a powerful influence over our minds, a fact which can be utilized to both good and evil ends. We often think of religion as a divisive force, and while it is true that it can be, it has also been one of the most instrumental uniting forces in history, and is likely responsible for our current level of behavioral sophistication. We can also take a Darwinian perspective, and ascertain that religion conveyed certain survival benefits, and something about religion enabled its perpetuation even to the modern day. These facts also demonstrate the shadow side of religion, in that one of its social functions is control, and the repression of certain behaviors. Social control leads to civilization, but at the cost of personal freedom, and the restriction of behavioral freedom can cause a buildup of society's collective shadow side. It is therefore crucial that we understand how religion functions, so that we can understand the extent of these effects. With respect to the psychology of religion, it is important to discuss one of the key features of religion, and that is the belief in certain metaphysical entities, such as the monotheistic God, polytheistic gods and goddesses, angels, demons, and numerous mythical creatures. Belief in such entities may be considered silly for the plain fact that these entities do not objectively exist in the outer world, and so the legitimacy of religion seems easily dismissible. However, this matter is significantly more complicated when examined from the perspective of the psyche. Carl Jung was exclusively a phenomenologist, and so took all occurring phenomena as potentially significant, including people's encounters with such entities. It is true even today that people encounter such entities as gods, angels, and demons, particularly in dreams, fantasies, and during hallucinatory states, such as those induced by prolonged fasting. These entities may not exist in a physical sense, but they do exist in a psychic sense, being manifestations of one's unconscious mind. We know that they originate from the unconscious, since they present themselves as being separate from the ego. As Jung writes, spirits, viewed from the psychological angle, are unconscious autonomous complexes, which appear as projections because they have no direct association with the ego. Such entities are of particular psychological significance, since they can give us insights into certain trends in the unconscious. The unconscious, being the repository of material discarded by the ego, is able to communicate with the conscious ego to provide helpful insights whenever our conscious orientation is insufficient. Many people have been aided by an inner voice or guardian angel, whose reality was of a purely psychic nature. Even René Descartes developed the idea of rationalism after an encounter with an angel in his dream. God is a psychological fact encountered by people through their psyches, and we need to acknowledge that the psyche should be taken seriously. Science has never discovered any God. Epistemological criticism proves the impossibility of knowing God, but the psyche comes forward with the assertion of the experience of God. God is a psychic fact of immediate experience. Otherwise, there would never have been any talk of God. It can be easy to ignore such manifestations as they arise, due to the modern bias, which purports that anything which seems to be spiritual in nature can be explained as being merely a hallucination. But Jung's perspective would be in complete disagreement with this point of view, since connecting with the unconscious psyche can be immensely beneficial. Analytical psychology seeks to break through these walls by digging up again the fantasy images of the unconscious, which our rationalism has rejected. These images lie beyond the walls. They are a part of the nature within us, which apparently lies buried in our past, and against which we have barricaded ourselves behind the walls of reason. One of Jung's patients frequently encountered religious symbolism within his dreams, pertaining to some sort of purification ritual. These dreams were almost always accompanied by a loud and commanding voice in possession of poignant philosophical insight. This, to Jung, suggested a link between religious ideas and the unconscious mind. Since this patient is by no means the only one I have observed who exhibited the phenomenon of the voice in dreams and in other peculiar states of consciousness, I am forced to admit that the unconscious is capable at times of manifesting an intelligence and purposiveness superior to the actual conscious insight. There can be no doubt that this is a basic religious phenomenon, observed here in a person whose conscious mental attitude certainly seemed most unlikely to produce religious phenomena. The relationship between the unconscious and religion is complicated, but it can roughly be described as reciprocal. It is clear that much religious imagery arises from the unconscious. It is also clear that this imagery, when depicted outside the psyche, activates our unconscious psychology, as though illuminating the deeper aspects of the mind. This powerful influence upon our minds is what gives religion its social power as a system of values, a philosophical inquiry, a method of control, and a way for mankind to imagine possibilities beyond their immediate reality. The idea of God would have had a very particular effect upon people's minds, an effect which would have been pronounced when people unquestionably believed in God, and the loss of this effect seems to have various psychological ramifications. Gods are idealizations, and such idealizations represent targets for humanity to reach, and in so doing we become more godlike, as history has amply demonstrated. The idea of a metaphysical ideal is purely an imaginary concept, but such imaginary concepts shape societies in profound ways. Jung was also preoccupied with the study of religious symbols, and his insights here provide us with a better sense of the significance of religion. Religious figures and symbols, as stated before, are themselves derived from the unconscious mind, and demonstrate the vast wealth of knowledge and insights which the unconscious supplies us with in order to aid us whenever we are internally conflicted, and this knowledge passes down from generation to generation, vastly increasing the wisdom of future generations. Primitive tribal lore is concerned with archetypes that have been modified in a special way. They are no longer contents of the unconscious, but have already been changed into conscious formulae taught according to tradition, generally in the form of esoteric teaching. This last is a typical means of expression for the transmission of collective contents originally derived from the unconscious. The commonality of certain symbols between religious groups demonstrate that many such symbols are derived from the collective layer of the psyche, which is composed of archetypes, psychic structures which are shared between all people. It is thus the experience of these symbols which provides a sense of connectedness between all people, and the feeling that religion connects us with something deeper. This sense of shared connectedness is something which humans, as a social species, fundamentally desire, which is why religions often emphasize the communal aspect. Religious symbols point to wisdom, which is relevant for life, and for dealing with pertinent issues pertaining to morality and the struggles we face during our journeys through life. For example, the symbol of death and rebirth, which appears commonly in religions, is an important concept in the life of every individual, and yet it doesn't pertain to anything we can call scientific. Religious symbols also point us to ideas and concepts which are difficult for the human mind to grasp, which perhaps gives them their seeming supernatural quality. Concepts like Brahman in Hinduism, which is the underlying structure of all reality, is a profound idea which points to something beyond the typical contemplation of human beings. One common characteristic of religion is myth, which often contains allegorical wisdom pertaining to life's problems, and is often able to illuminate the subtler, more poignant aspects of existence. The myth of the hero overcoming a dangerous foe contains psychological insights which, again, pertain to how we ought to behave in life, and what we need to do in order to overcome the challenges which we may be confronted with. The wisdom espoused by religious systems is practical and pertains to spiritual issues which arise from life itself, and so while they aren't true in the typical scientific and historical sense, they can nevertheless be immensely illuminating. The topic of religious symbolism and its psychology is a huge theme, and we will have to return to it in a later video. But in short, religious symbols represent a way to commune with the unconscious, and to come into contact with the manifestations which arise therefrom. We often think of religion as a false set of beliefs, a position which is genuinely understandable, given many of the assumptions made by religious systems. However, there is a case to be made that the psychological effects of such beliefs may still be useful, beneficial, and psychologically healthy. We need to remember that many of the insights of religion can be seen as an attempt by mankind to find higher wisdom in order to deal with its psychological difficulties. Belief in the afterlife is a natural consequence of people who have contemplated the seeming impermanence of life and wish for something beyond. The belief in a loving God is desirable in a world which often seems cruel and indifferent. This is likely why religious individuals enjoy better mental health, because they are bound in a structure which anticipates their existential concerns. The positive effects of religion upon our minds were likely even stronger in the past, when belief in religion seemed unquestionable. How totally different did the world appear to medieval man? For him, the earth was eternally fixed, and at rest in the center of the universe, encircled by the course of a sun that solicitously bestowed its warmth. Men were all children of God, under the loving care of the Most High, who prepared them for eternal blessedness, and all knew exactly what they should do and how they should conduct themselves in order to rise from a corruptible world to an incorruptible and joyous existence. Such a life no longer seems real to us, even in our dreams. Natural science has long ago torn this lovely veil to shreds. Participation in religious rituals and rites also confers particular psychological effects, which can be beneficial to the individual. Rites, such as that of baptism, symbolize rebirth, rejuvenation, and redemption, and the feeling of redemption is important for overcoming feelings of shame and inadequacy. Dogma expresses the psyche more completely than scientific theory, for the latter gives expression to and formulates the conscious mind alone. Furthermore, a theory can do nothing except formulate a living thing in abstract terms. Dogma, on the contrary, aptly expresses the living process of the unconscious, in the form of the drama of repentance, sacrifice, and redemption. Furthermore, a consequence of the relatively sudden shift away from religion is that psychic energy, which at one time was preoccupied by religion, now flows outward and away from its original source, which may explain our seeming devotion to messianic political figures as a substitute to worshiping God. We may think of ourselves as rational beings, but humans are wired for certain behaviors which are religious in nature. After all, we have been evolving alongside religion for nearly 100,000 years. Only in the Age of Enlightenment did people discover that the gods did not really exist, but were simply projections. Thus, the gods were disposed of, but the corresponding psychological function was by no means disposed of. elapsed into the unconscious, and men were thereupon poisoned by the surplus of libido that had once been laid up in the cult of divine images. The devaluation and repression of so powerful a function as the religious function naturally have serious consequences for the psychology of the individual. It may be easy to conclude from this that it would be better to be religious. However, the matter is not this simple. We can't simply return to religion, because the veil has been torn. God is dead, so to speak. Instead, we should endeavor to understand the psychology of religion, why it is able to grip our minds in so powerful a way, and how it contributes positively to our mental health. We should also learn to adopt a new attitude to religion, not one of hostility, but rather of an acknowledgement of the important problems religion attempts to remedy. The philosophical insights of religion, particularly its capacity for illuminating the human mind and the human condition, provides us with a way to derive value from religion without actually being religious. We should additionally find a way to redirect our natural tendency towards metaphysical ideas in a healthier and more constructive manner, and find ways to collectively express values, since it is impossible for human beings to live without some metaphysical system of moral beliefs. This is why my channel has discussed the psychology of religion, and more videos will be forthcoming which will tackle the psychology of religion in more detail, so please subscribe if you want to learn more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.